So in this video, I want to take a look here at the content of Genesis 1 and 2 very briefly and highlight just some of the major themes in this portion of Genesis. So what we find here in the book that's kind of known as the Origins is that God is presented as Yahweh Elohim very early on in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. And this expression, Yahweh Elohim, is quite significant because it does combine two words, the covenant name of God, Yahweh, as well as the generic name for God, Elohim. So Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh God, the name that is for is the Israelites' God, is recognized as the creator of all things. So in Exodus, God is going to reveal himself to Moses as Yahweh, but here the author of Genesis 1 and 2, whoever that might be, whenever they may have lived, is going to use the name which the Israelites have come to use to identify God. Now, this name is also presented in the important passage where God reveals himself to Abraham and is calling Abraham to come and take possession of the land in the book of Genesis. So the name of God was used to express the special relationship Israel has with God. This people knows the name of the Creator and Lord of the universe. They have been rescued from slavery by Yahweh Elohim and has pledged themselves to live as his covenant people. So again, within the covenant, it's the idea that there are certain obligations that the people who accept to live in that covenant oblige themselves to, and recognizing that there are benefits that God will provide for them because of their obedience to that covenant, their faithfulness to that covenant. And there are also disciplines or punishments when those people are not obedient or not faithful to those covenant stipulations. So the Genesis story of creation is likely meant to offer a rebuttal to the stories of creation that are known from other people. So in particular, there are stories that are known by the Egyptians or the Babylonians or the Canaanites. And so the Genesis story is acting in a kind of an apologetic way or an argumentative way with those other stories, correcting, as it were, what the Israelites might believe about the Creator God or about the existence of other gods and about their God, and trying to make sure that they understand that their God is not just one in a pantheon of gods, but is actually the one who's responsible for the existence of all creation and even all what may be called gods. So Israel's God is not a regional deity. Their God is the creator and Lord over everything that exists, even the sun and moon, which has been worshipped as gods or were worshipped as gods by other cultures. And so instead of treating the sun and the moons as God, the Israelites are supposed to see that there is another being responsible for the sun and moon's existence, as well as everything else. Human beings are the pinnacle of God's creation, not a mere additional element of creation. So, as such, they alone are made in God's image, which is quite a loaded idea about God's image. So, whether or not the ancient Israelites thought of God having an actual form may be questionable, but the image of God is understanding God's activity, particularly. So they exhibit God's image when they, as God does, create and exercise sovereignty. So the purpose of human beings as being made in God's image is to be creative and to exercise rule or sovereignty over creation. They are the representation of God's creative and sovereignty. So they are to care for creation and care for each other and care for themselves, just like God cares for his creation. So by exercising this stewardship, by exercising this caring, they are demonstrating that they are demonstrating a faithfulness to being made in God's image. The Creator desires humans to live, thrive, and work in the place where He has placed them. So in other words, He places them in Eden, He places them in a garden, He places them on the earth. That is the design, that is the purpose. God could have created human beings who would live in a non-physical environment if He wanted to. Of course, He has angels, and there are gods, and there are other beings and powers that He is responsible for having created. But that's not what He wants with humans. He wants them on the earth, and He wants them to be exercising authority over the earth, and He wants them to be creating and producing and flourishing. And so He wants to live in relationship with them as they are carrying out this image-bearing activity. So at creation, the created order lived in compliance with God's will for it. So all of creation, animals, the world itself, the cosmos, and the first created beings all lived according to God's will. God initially would walk in the midst of creation. So this idea of walking, of course, is anthropomorphic. God doesn't actually have legs and feet, but the author is expressing this idea of God's presence in the garden with His creation. He wants to interact with human beings in the environment in which He has created them to live, and desires humans to live in knowledge of their Creator. So He's not just creating and leaving creation to themselves to figure out what they need to do. He's present with them. He wants them to know Him, because as they know Him, then they know how to exercise their own creativity and their own sovereignty in the world. And all of this, He wants them to thrive as creators themselves, but to thrive in partnership. So He didn't just create one human. He creates two, and from these two, they represent this partnerships. Human beings are not created to live alone. We're not created to be isolated. We're supposed to live in community with others, and it's in that community with others that we carry out our God image-bearing responsibility in creating and exercising sovereignty in the world. So Genesis 1:26 through 28 is not a proof text for environmental callousness. So here's where God kind of instructs the first humans to subdue the earth, to bring it under their control, to exercise their rule over it. But this text shouldn't be used to say that human beings can just do whatever they want with creation. They are supposed to be good stewards of creation. God holds them accountable to be good stewards of that. So God gave humans one boundary, and that boundary, stipulated in Genesis 2:17, is that they should not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's a very interesting command to give. So why, of all things, is this the one thing? Why is there even a tree there? You didn't want them to eat it. So lots of theological questions arise because of this. That things people need to kind of explore. What's the point of putting something there as a temptation, but then where they could rebel against God? Why just not create a world in which they can't? So, there's been different theories about why this is done. It's not really explained in the text itself. But of course, the tree does become this desire of both the man and the woman to eat of it, and to, in a sense, as they're going to be tempted, to become like God. And so really the narrative is trying to address a desire within human beings, and somehow or another, to be like God. In other words, to break the order that God has set. God has not created human beings to be gods. And but here is a way that they could become like God, but they are told not to be. So we'll end there with a brief little outline of Genesis 1 and 2. And so you'll get something of a sense of what's contained in these chapters.